Hello, students. Welcome. My name is Mrs. Simney. I teach English at West Florence High School, and I'm going to be talking to you today about analyzing poetry. And I know a lot of students get kind of intimidated a little bit with poetry because it seems like it's just like a totally different language. So today I'm going to go over with you a technique that's going to help you analyze a poem and hopefully help you get over a little bit of that intimidation that you might feel when you're asked to look at a poem and analyze it. So our lesson overview, our goals and purposes is to understand what poetic structure is and identify the different components of structure. Understand the function of specific words and phrases, including figurative language. Recognize and understand the use of contrasts. And then finally, to be able to recognize the above and analyze how they contribute to the meaning. So all of the above, how do we look at all of those things and how do they help us figure out what the meaning of the poem is, or a message, if you will. So the first form of poetry we're going to talk about, because it's so closed, and by closed I mean it's pretty structured. So if you come across one of these, it gives you a lot of clues that will help you in analyzing the poem. So it's the sonnet. There are actually two types of sonnets, the English or Shakespearean sonnet and the Italian or Petrarchan sonnet. But no matter what kind of sonnet it is, a sonnet has 14 lines. And I always tell my students that if it's a square, it's a sonnet. And I mean that literally. If you look at it on the page and it's in the shape of a square, it's probably a sonnet. Okay, so if it looks square-like on the page and you count the lines and it has 14, you can be fairly certain that you've got a sonnet there. A sonnet must be written in iambic pentameter, and that simply just plainly means that it has 10 beats of syllables per line. Okay, so each line is 10 syllables long, which also helps contribute to that square form that I was just talking about on the page. A sonnet must follow a specific rhyme scheme depending on the type of sonnet. A sonnet can be about any subject, though they are often about love or nature. And a sonnet will introduce a problem or a question or a scenario in the beginning. And then in the second half of the poem, after what's called the turn or the volta, a resolution is offered. And the resolution can come in the form of answering the question that was asked, or connecting what was talked about in the beginning to something else and making a meaning out of that. Okay, so that's so when you get a sonnet, it's pretty, you know that you're looking for it to turn or to shift at some point in the poem. And that is really valuable knowledge when it comes to analyzing a poem. So today we're going to look at the Italian sonnet, which is also called the Petrarchan sonnet after the man who originated it. It includes an octave, which is 8 lines. Okay, so if you think about the word or the root OCT, meaning 8, and think about octopus or octagon or other words that you know have to do with 8. So the first 8 lines, and then a sestet, which is 6 lines, of course. So the rhyme scheme with an Italian sonnet is A-B-B-A, A-B-B-A. And I tell my students it's ABBA, ABBA. And that is the octave. And then the last 6 lines, the sestet, can conclude with a variation of C, D, and E. Okay. The turn or the volta must occur between the octave and the sestet. So if you have an Italian sonnet, that's really great because you know exactly where the shift is, where the turn is going to be, and you can kind of look for it and decide, well, what is the poet doing here? How is this turn occurring? You know, did they change subjects? Did they connect the first subject to a different subject? What are they doing there? And you know exactly where to look for it. And so that's very, very valuable. So we're going to use a poetry analysis technique that I really like, and it's called BLAST. And it's an acronym for B as in for basic. So for basics, you're just kind of looking at the poem and going through and explaining or doing a little summary or paraphrase about what's really happening in this part of the poem. And how you do your basics is going to depend on the poem. So if you have a poem that has several stanzas, you might do a summary of each stanza. Well, in this stanza, this is what's going on. In the next stanza, this is what's going on. For a sonnet, of course, you're probably, if you're doing an Italian sonnet, you're probably going to look at what's going on in the first 8 lines and then what's going on in the last 6 lines. Language has a lot of different things that can go with it. So we could be looking at specific word choice, diction choices that have been made by the poet. Also, figurative language, similes, metaphors, personifications could go under this as well. And we look at those things, and they help us to understand what the poet is trying to say. A is for attitude. So attitude, of course, is how the speaker is feeling toward the subject. Are they sad? Are they angry? Are they mournful? What are they? Okay, so finding the attitude is important. S stands for shifts and structures. And I've already talked about those. So as if it's a sonnet, an Italian sonnet in this case, you're going to find the shift after the 8th line. But all poems have shifts. A poem will start somewhere and end somewhere else. That's kind of the point of it. If you think about a poem as being sort of like a personal diary, it's a way for someone to maybe get their thoughts or their feelings out in a very creative way. And so there's always a poem will not begin and end with in the same place. It goes somewhere. It takes you somewhere. And where does it take you? Well, that leads us to T, which is the thematic statement. So after we look at all of the other things, it helps us kind of come to the conclusion as to what is this poem saying? And, and usually the thematic statement needs to have something to do with life in general. Like, what message about life is this poem giving us? Okay. So it's something that everyone can relate to, or a lot of people can relate to. Okay, so let's look at the poem that we're going to look at today. And it is A Cross of Snow by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. So Longfellow is one of the fireside poets who wrote during the American Renaissance period. He is one of 4 poets who were known as the fireside poets, and basically because their poems were read by the fire at night. This is a time before TV, before even radio, and poetry was very, very popular as a form of entertainment. And Longfellow was one of the most famous and the most beloved of the fireside poets here in America. So his poem is called A Cross of Snow, and we know it's going to be an Italian sonnet. He actually wrote this poem for 18 years after the death of his second wife. She died in a household fire, a very tragic death. And he wrote this about that. A Cross of Snow. In the long sleepless watches of the night, a gentle face, the face of one long dead, looks at me from the wall, where round its head the night lamp casts a halo of pale light. Here in this room she died, and soul more white never through martyrdom of fire was led to its repose. Nor can in books be read the legend of a life more benedight. There is a mountain in the distant west that, sun-defying in its deep ravines, displays a cross of snow upon its side. Such is the cross I wear upon my breast these 18 years, through all the changing scenes and seasons, changeless since the day she died. Okay. So one thing that this poem does, and if you were looking at this in your textbook, there would be a footnote telling you he's making an allusion to a mountain in the distant west, okay? And I'm going to pull up a picture here. And this is actually a real place. It's called the Mount of the Holy Cross. It's in Colorado. And there's actually a painting of it. And basically, the elevation of the mountain is so high, and it has two ravines that crisscross. And the elevation is so high that the snow never, ever melts. So if you are looking at the mountain from the right angle, the right distance, you will always see this cross of snow. It never goes away. And that's what Longfellow is alluding to in this poem. Okay, so that's kind of important to remember. Ooh, let's go back to, all right. So right away, we see here, of course, that the shift, I put a line here. This is the shift. It's got the standard Italian sonnet rhyme scheme, A, B, B, A. You know, that, of course, that the first sound is A, night. And then the next sound, dead, does not rhyme with night, so that would be B. Head rhymes with dead, so that is B again. And then light rhymes with night, and that is A, and so forth. Okay, you know how to do rhyme scheme. So we know that our shift comes right here. Okay, he's talking about something here, and then he shifts to talking about the mountain. Okay, so we're actually going to go to a different screen to do a little annotation of this poem. Okay, so this is a Google Google drawing, and this gives me the tools I need to do some annotating of this poem. Okay, so we know that our shift is right here. So I could go down here and maybe do a little highlight. I'm going to highlight my shift in a light blue color, so that's where it shifts. But if we're going through our blast, so the first thing we want to do is talk about what's happening in the two parts of the poem. Okay, so in this first part, and usually I would read this, reread this in class to my students and ask them, what is going on here? In the long sleepless watches of the night, what's happening? What is he doing? And invariably someone would say he sleepless watches, he can't sleep. Okay, and we can all relate to not being able to sleep. And then he says, a gentle face, the face of one long dead, looks at me from the wall. What is he looking at? How can the face of a long dead loved one, a gentle face, look at him from the wall? And you're probably thinking the same thing my students think, is of course that is, he's looking at a painting or a picture of this person. Okay. And then the rest of the octave has a lot of description of her. Okay, so that's what we can put for our B, our basic for this part. Well, of course, you always run into some problems. There we go. Okay, so I'm just going to put the speaker can't sleep and is looking at the face of a loved one in a painting or a picture. Okay. We're using a computer. Normally, if I were in my classroom, I would probably be using my smartboard and just writing on it. But since we are all digital right now, this is the way we're going to do it. Okay, so this is my basic, and I can put a B here if I want to. I'll do that for this part. Okay, and then we know what's happening in this part, so we can do another basic for this part, and that is the speaker is describing a mountain ravine in the shape of a cross that never melts. Okay. So we've got our basics. We know what's happening. Okay. So now the next thing in our blast is L for language. Okay. So if we go back to this first part, it's always interesting to me to look at the words that Longfellow uses to describe his wife, to describe this face that's looking at him from the wall. And I would, of course, ask my students to help me identify those. And maybe you are thinking of some as you're watching. Oop, I did not want to do that. Got to get out of there. There we go. So I'm going to just go through and highlight, maybe with yellow, not all of it, highlight in some of the, I guess I'll need to highlight first, some of the words that describe this person. So perhaps I might highlight gentle, halo, okay, is a good one to highlight. Here I'm going to highlight the whole phrase where he's describing her soul as white. I'm going to highlight the martyrdom of fire because I think that's an interesting metaphor there. And perhaps this word here, benedict. The word benedict means blessed. And that might be a word that you would look up. Okay. So then once I look at the words I have highlighted, gentle, halo, soul more white, martyrdom of fire, benedict, meaning blessed. I would then ask my students, how is he feeling about this person that he's writing this poem about? What was, to him, what was she like? And you're probably thinking of the same things my students think of. He says that she has a halo, or there's a halo around her picture, which maybe implies an angelic nature of her, and that would definitely go with the gentle face. He describes her soul as white, and white is often a color used to represent purity or goodness. The word benedict, of course, means blessed. I might even highlight the word legend, because obviously if you think about something as a legend that becomes larger than life, that you can't, that's always with you, and that's kind of how he's feeling about her. The martyrdom of fire, to me, is always a really interesting phrase there, because given what I told you is how his wife died in a household fire. So a martyr is usually someone who dies for a cause. And so you see that her death seems like it had more meaning to it than just, she just died in a household fire. So all of these words, if you look at them all together, it really shows his love for her, his feelings of her being just this wonderful, gentle, pure, good soul. Okay, so this gives us an idea of how he was feeling. And if you think about those words, the fact that she died must have left a very big hole in his life. Okay. Then we come to the language. I mean, we're still doing language. So let's go down to the sestet. And there's a lot of things we could talk about, but the one that I always kind of pick up on, he talks about the mountain, which I showed you the painting of. And then he says, such is the cross I wear upon my breast. Okay, so he's comparing the mountain to the cross he wears upon his breast. And he says this cross is changeless since the day she died for 18 years. Okay, so a lot of times students will think, well, he's wearing a like a cross necklace. Um, but I want you to think about the term cross, maybe as a more abstract term. Like you might say, this is the cross I have to bear, or Jesus, if we look at a biblical Jesus bearing the cross. So yes, he actually carried a cross, but it's representative of burden. Okay, so to me, I think this metaphor here kind of represents the burden that he feels. Okay, um, so the cross is a metaphor for his burden. And we might ask ourselves, why is he so burdened? Um, I mean, obviously, he loved his wife, but 18 years, that's a really, really long time. Um, and perhaps there are many different reasons that has not been able to get over her death, changeless since the day she died. Okay. Um, so we might, you know, his grief has not subsided at all, which is, in 18 years. So that's a really, really long time. And it really shows us how much he really loved his wife. Um, so, some other things I might do as I was going through, we talked about these, but we didn't like write them out. But Benedict means blessed, of course. We talked about soul, more white, kind of representing that he sees her as pure and good. Um, the halo kind of shows that as well. All right. So then, if we then come up with the attitude, I think this attitude in this poem is probably not too difficult um, to come up with, but um, we could say sad, mournful. Um, we might even go so far as to say guilty. Why hasn't he gotten over her death in 18 years? Perhaps he feels a little bit of survivor's guilt, like he couldn't save her. Okay, so those could be words that would describe the attitude. Okay, we've talked about our shifts already. I'm gonna, there we go. There's our shift right there. Um, this is our shift to talking about the mountain. And the purpose of the shift was to compare the mountain and its cross of snow, of course, to his burden with the death of his wife. So then we come to our thematic statement, our last thing. And I always tell my students that for their thematic statement, they need to make it in the form of a complete sentence. Okay. So I'm going to go all out and say, in a cross of snow by Longfellow. I could say his whole name if I wanted to. So, in a cross of snow by Longfellow, the speaker is mourning the death of his wife, revealing the message or theme that death can be difficult to overcome, or not death, but sorrow from death can be difficult to overcome. Okay, and that's the message. Um, so there we go. We've got the whole poem and we've blasted it and we broke it down and we saw a lot of different things that helped us come to this conclusion that that sorrow from death can be very difficult to overcome. Okay, go back to my presentation. And so now it's going to be your turn. Okay, So you're going to have a document attached to this lesson that you are going to blast. Actually, there are going to be 2 poems, and you get to choose which one that you want to blast. So make sure that you are identifying the parts that you're summarizing, the language and what they mean, the attitude, the shifts, and the thematic statements. Both of the poems on your assignment are Italian sonnets, so that should really help you with identifying where the shift occurs. So thank you all for listening, and I hope you learned something, and I can't wait to look at what you come up with the poems that you've been given.